It is here where things are lost. It is here where things are found. It is here where I reside. Welcome to the void.
So, it seems you have found yourself back in the void. Well, I hope you're in no rush to leave. I've found something else to show you. What is one to do when the old ways have been forgotten? When your kind are nothing more than myth and legend? How is one going to get by in such strange times? Over the years, nature had fallen into neglect. As the human population grew, natural resources were stripped from their habitat, mined from their dwelling, and hoarded amongst the most elite of humankind, while others, well, they simply had to make do. Going out without a raincoat was one of the first mistakes Richard would make that day. When he left to get the train, the sun was shining and the air was still. What he did not consider was the fact that there were no birds calling, not even the odd crow or sparrow. There was no movement in the hedgerow or trees. It was silent. Now those who are attuned with nature will know that this is usually the sign of an oncoming storm. And those who are sensible will know to check the weather forecast before they leave the house. Richard had no time for nature. It got in his way, quite literally, as he was a property developer in the southwest. While cities would grow, so would the population. And with a growing population, there was a growth in pollution. With more pollution, there was more need to travel away from the large, infested cities. Richard saw this as an opportunity to make money. If he would build it, they would come, no matter the price. He'd made himself a small fortune, enough to live a quiet and comfortable life. But this was not enough. He wanted more. The previous summer, he had made the headlines in the local paper. Most successful property developer in the southwest. He was not a man of subtlety. As soon as he acquired the paper, he went to the local coffee shop to make a point of reading it in the window seat. Local celebrity was a strong term to use, but he was very well known throughout the town, and people knew where he liked to frequent, and he knew they knew. To the shop owner's annoyance, he stayed there the entire day. As customers came and went, they would either come up and congratulate him, or he would instigate conversation and point out his successes to them. There wasn't much the shop owners could do, for this was another one of his properties. It was late afternoon when a tall man entered the shop. He had shoulder-length chestnut hair, styled to frame his face. He wore a well-tailored three-piece suit and had a long trench coat draped on his shoulder. As he walked in, he took off his sunglasses to reveal bright green eyes, and if you looked closely, you could have sworn that they twinkled. He walked over to the counter and smiled at the barista. "Could I have one of your strongest coffees, please? Black, no sugar." She smiled and nodded and got to it. While waiting, the tall man glanced around the shop. He clocked Richard in the window, who, at the time, was gawping at him. The tall man chuckled to himself and turned back to the barista. "Can I get whatever my friend over there in the window is drinking, please?" The barista obliged and got another pot of tea for Richard. He placed a handful of notes on the counter. "Keep the change." He smiled politely and took the drinks over to the window. "Mind if I join you?"
Sorry, do I know you?"
"No, but you're about to." The tall man grinned and sat opposite Richard. He placed his coat on the back of his chair, unbuttoned his red velvet waistcoat, and stretched a pale yet strong hand out to the man in front of it. "My name is Cedric Goidwick. Pleased to meet you. You must be Richard Avarice. I've heard a lot about you."
"Have you? Well, yeah, you must have done. Here, have you seen today's local paper?"
Richard said, and pointed to the one in his hand.
"Oh, by the way, you overpaid for those drinks, you know. They don't cost that much. I saw how much you put on the counter." Talk about a large tip.
Cedric looked in the direction of the paper, but paid no mind to it, or what Richard was saying. Instead, he took into account the ink stains on Richard's fingers. I see you've been reading that paper extensively today. You must be incredibly pleased with yourself, he said pleasantly, and brought his hand back to his drink.
Well, it's not every day you make the paper.
Evidently.
Well, it's just, right. Well, excuse me, why have you joined me?
Now, I'm also in the property market, to a degree. I own a lot of land in part of the surrounding area. It's been in the family for generations. I couldn't help but notice that your developments are moving ever closer to my land.
Mean that woodland that's beyond the hills? You're absolutely right, I've not touched it. Though it's funny you're here now, as I've been looking high and low to find out who owned that land, and like a miracle you've fallen into my lap.
Cedric raised an eyebrow at the statement, but nodded regardless. It's almost as though fate has brought us together.
Exactly, Richard exclaimed,
and started to pour his own cup of tea. Must have made a lot of money on these new developments. I'd hazard to bet that the local community are very grateful.
How do you mean?
Well, you've earned so much from them. You must have given back in some way. A local park, money towards the dilapidated town hall, charities, and so on.
Well, I suppose if it weren't for me, the builders wouldn't have a job, would they? People wouldn't be able to buy the shops like this one, and if they're from the city, they can get away from the smog and live here. So you see, I'm doing them a justice.
Cedric said nothing, but sipped his coffee. He looked out of the window for a brief moment, and then back to Richard. How about we make a deal? Like a child who had been given cake on their birthday, Richard's eyes lit up. I'm listening. If you find yourself needing to build properties, and you find yourself edging ever closer to the woodlands, inform me first, and if we can come to an arrangement, a development that does not infringe or harm the forest, a development that enriches the populace and natural habitat, only then can you build in that area. Richard slowly set his teacup down and looked Cedric in the eye. My deal is my bond, he said smugly, and reached his hand out towards the other. Fine, Cedric said calmly. He took Richard's hand in his own and shook it firmly. Pleasure doing business with you. Until next time. He got up, finished the rest of his coffee, and took the cup over to the counter. Thank you, he said, and placed 2 more notes on the counter. For your trouble. He smiled and put his coat over his shoulder, walked to the door, and turned his head to Richard. I'll look forward to hearing from you, he swiftly said, and left the shop. Richard watched the man leave and stretched. He finally got up from his seat and put on his own jacket, left the paper carelessly on the table among the countless other pots and cups that he had had throughout the day. He paid no mind to the barista and left the shop and his rubbish behind. On the train journey, Richard had watched as the skies grew darker the further he travelled from the countryside. He grumbled to himself as he stuffed the return ticket into his trouser pocket. It was a year later, and he found himself trudging through the torrential rain. The sky, like the skyscrapers above him, was grey. He walked down the narrow and busy labyrinthian streets. Until he finally got to his destination and relentlessly rang the bell until someone answered it.
It's about time. Let me in, I'm soaked, he said as he pushed his way through.
Richard, it's a pleasure as always. I'm glad you got my letter, Cedric said lightly and closed the door behind him, silently locking it. Now, why don't you come in and dry off? Wouldn't want you catching a cold. Led Richard into his living room and sat in an armchair. Please, take a seat. Can I get you anything to eat or drink? Perhaps a tea? I have a fine herbal one that will help warm and calm the nerves.
Yes, a tea sounds like the right thing just about now.
Cedric nodded and got up. He He brought the tray laden with a teapot, sugar, honey and biscuits and 2 cups back to them. "Drink. You'll feel better," he said as he poured his own, black with no sugar. Richard poured himself a cup and heaped sugar into it. He picked up a biscuit and sat back in his own chair.
"Couldn't you have picked a better day to call me here, Goidwig? The weather's horrible."
"I'm sorry you were caught short, but I'm afraid it had to be today. If you recall, it was a year ago today that we'd met."
"That's, sentimental of you. I do remember. Yeah, actually. Funny, because we've not spoken since."
"You're absolutely right. We've not spoken since. Not one word, not one phone call or letter."
"So?"
"We made a deal, Richard. Don't you remember? We shook hands. We made a bargain."
"A deal? A handshake? That's not legally binding. It's not written. It's not to be held to the highest account by law. It's meaningless. It's worthless."
"My word is my bond. I believe that's what you said. Those were the words that you used."
"Cedric, if you've called me here for some sort of 1-year anniversary of words, you're off your head."
"Hardly. I brought you here because you went back on your word."
"Like I said, it's not legally binding."
Drake got up from his seat and opened a desk drawer. "Read this, if you will," he said, and handed the parchment to Richard. As soon as Richard's fingertips touched the paper, writing appeared. "I, Richard Avarice, agree to the terms presented to me by Cedric Goidwig." I willingly shook his hand, and in doing so set the deal to come to fruition.
This is ridiculous. It's a trick. How did you do that?"
"I did nothing. This is all you." The ink from the tabloid spread to your hand, which then spread to me. We together formed the deal. There was no trickery on my part. You went back on your word, Richard," Cedric said slowly, and walked up and stood before him, towering calmly above him. "You made a promise. You made a deal, and you broke it. Your properties have spread like wildfire. You have decimated my forest. I told you that it had been in my family for generations, long before the likes of you ever existed."
"You live here, I live there. People deed homes and I made them."
"So you keep saying. But what of the homes of the inhabitants of the forest? They'll move elsewhere. There's nowhere else to go. They'll make do. Not if they were killed by your infernal machines. Not mine, I just hired them."
"Exactly.
You are the catalyst and the cataclysm. And you will not go unpunished." Fear had begun to set in. Richard tried to move, but he couldn't. He seemed rooted to the spot. All I asked was to work together. We could have created something beautiful. A haven, a place for the likes of you and I. We could have got along in peace and harmony. But humans like you, you're all the same.
Don't you mean people like me?"
No, I don't. I only wish that one day the likes of you and I can work together. I'm deeply saddened our deal did not come to pass, Richard Avarice.
"Give me one more chance. I can fix this."
Thunder rolled and lightning crashed around them, and in a split moment, Richard Avarice was no more. Skies cleared, and the birds started to sing. The hustle and bustle of city life continued on. Cedric slumped back into his armchair and looked down at his hand. One return ticket to the countryside. Time to make amends.